Shabbat shalom, everyone. Who here remembers the movie Rain Man? One of the best movies of all time, great acting, great story, and introduced us really as a society to those who struggle with autism. Except in days of yore, a generation ago, and even before that, people who struggled with autism were often put into institutions, like was depicted in the movie Rain Man. Today, thank goodness, they are living in homes and society in a much more integrated fashion. One of my favorite scenes in the movie Rain Man is when the lead character, Raymond, is walking across the street. Now, he's not socially attuned because he struggles with autism. He doesn't have any sense of nuance. He is linear in every way. And because of that, he lives a very regimented life in an institution. But when his brother takes him out of the institution, he's walking down the street. There's a street sign that says walk, and he crosses the corner, and he starts to walk, and then the sign blinks, don't walk. And Raymond, as he's called by his brother, or Raymond, says, uh-oh. And he stops in the middle. And he doesn't know, in the middle of the street, should I keep walking or not walking? It said walk, now it says don't walk. And here he is in the middle of the intersection, and he is torn between whether I should keep going or not, because he is linear. He lives without nuance. And he doesn't know, if it says don't walk, and I'm in the middle of the street, what do I do? And he creates a traffic jam. Well, the majority of the world, and definitely the majority of America, thank God, is not suffering through autism or Asperger's. We were given a gift from God called nuance, called appreciation of circumstances. And it allows us to maneuver and to dance and to contort to particular situations. But what has happened in today's society has become another form of intersectionality, not the intersection that Raymond found himself on, but an intersectionality that in order to be in favor or to stand in one camp, you must be against the other. And that has created a linear sense for how we people can appreciate nuance or behaving. And the intersectionality for us morally is that if we're nuanced, why are we approaching situations so linearly? I'd like to share with you 3 examples of how that's happened in my life, and one piece of advice for me and for all of you that I hope can help us navigate through. I have been struggling mightily about 24 months ago, maybe even more, especially after the death of George Floyd, with the notion of Black Lives Matter. And I'm going to be very open, honest, and raw with all of you. I thought the death of George Floyd was a travesty. And I think it was a breaking point in America to show how black people, black men in particular, are treated differently by police than white men overall. Not every officer, not every case, but overall, that there were injustices that happened to black people. And I don't appreciate them because I was born white. So I definitely believe in the idea that Black Lives Matter, that the idea that there are black people that are seen in a different light or in a different way is an injustice to what our founding ancestors created for this country and what we should strive for. And I firmly believe that the notion of Black Lives Matter and the movement of Black Lives Matter is something that we as a community and we as Jews and I as David Kirshner should embrace. But for those who follow closely, and you don't have to deep dive into this to know, the Black Lives Matter movement has adopted in its charter an anti-Israel stance. It doesn't have an anti-Taiwan stance, doesn't have an anti-China stance, doesn't have an anti-Iran stance, doesn't have an anti-Saudi Arabia stance. There's no other country that is pointed out in the Charter of Black Lives Matter except for Israel, which is a fantastic irony because Israel is the only country in modern times to have airlifted people out of Africa or taken people out of Africa to freedom. Every other country in the last 200 years that has taken black people out of Africa has enslaved them. Israel's the only country that took black people out of Africa to be given them a chance of freedom. So the idea that Israel is singled out as an oppressor by Black Lives Matter is very problematic for me. It's something I don't embrace and I reject wholeheartedly. So what do? I feel like Rain Man. It's walk, don't walk. I'm at this intersection that says Black Lives Matter. If I'm a black person, they are more subject to some levels of injustice that happen in our society and by the police. And I want to be supportive of all black lives and to let my black brothers and sisters know that I, as a white American Jew, stand with them. But I am totally repulsed by their charter. So what do? I feel just like Rain Man in the middle of the intersection of walk and don't walk. Walk and don't walk. Walk and don't walk. A few weeks ago, a tragedy happened in Israel. There was a firefight between Hamas militants and the Israeli Defense Forces. And the press was caught in the middle of this firefight. And one of the journalist who was caught was an American Palestinian woman by the name of Shireen Abu Akleh. She was clearly wearing a helmet and a flak jacket, and it said press on it in very large letters. And still, a bullet killed her instantly. After much masa matan, back and forth and up and down as to responsibility, it looks like, almost conclusively, but not exactly yet, that the bullet that killed Shireen Abu Akleh was an Israeli bullet, shot by an Israeli soldier. We don't know, maybe the higher-ups do, but we don't know who that soldier was, and we don't know that soldier's motive, whether that was innocent crossfire or whether she was targeted because she was seen to be a terrorist. But any way you slice it, it's a tragedy. Because I believe in the freedom of the press. I believe the press is important. I believe regardless of what network you're working for, you should have that freedom and be celebrated. And I believe in the right of Israel to defend itself, especially against Hamas militants, especially in hotbeds like Jenin. But at the same time, when Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, and it looks like she was killed by an Israeli bullet, it's a terrible thing. And if you were to peruse my social media page, what you would see is 75% of the people on that page would say something akin to, the IDF didn't shoot her, she shouldn't have been there, they can do no wrong, how many times has this happened in American culture or in this culture and no one calls it out and they're picking on the Israelis and all of these other pieces. And that wasn't my response. The other 25% had a response of, Israel is an aggressor, an oppressor, a terrible state. How could they do this to people? This is wrong. They're finally going to be found guilty of all the crimes they've done against humanity, including this innocent journalist. And here I am, right back in the middle of the street of walk, don't walk. Walk, don't walk. Any of you who've known me for more than 10 minutes have a hard time questioning my love, passion, and bona fides when it comes to the issue of Zionism and support for the state of Israel. It's not about putting down Israel and its right to defend itself. But I also believe that Israel can make mistakes, and I also believe that we have to own those mistakes, and I also believe that we do have the freedom of the press and the press who's there, and we should celebrate those freedoms while they're there. Walk, don't walk. Walk, don't walk. About 2.5 years into our marriage, before we had children, my wife, who has a beautiful, fantastic, and large family, was celebrating the bat mitzvah of one of her cousins in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And one of the reasons why my wife and I work so well together is we have a similar ethic from her family and my family, which is we go to simchas. We're not going to miss happy occasions. So when her cousin was getting her bat mitzvah in Albuquerque, and we didn't have kids, we jumped on a plane and we went. The only problem is that there was no hotel in walking distance to the shul where the bat mitzvah was happening. So the options for me as someone who didn't drive on Shabbat was to not attend the service or to drive and attend the service. And where I was ritually and where I was religiously 20 years ago on this issue is different than where I am today, which shows that we grow on this issue and change. But for me, I was passionate about not getting in a car on Shabbat unless someone's life was on the line. And I remember Dory saying to me, David, this is my family. I want to go and celebrate my family. And I remember saying, I believe that, but Judaism is important to me, and I believe in the lens and view of Judaism that says we don't drive on the Shabbat. And she said, David, I understand that, and I agree that, and I've accepted that as your wife. But driving today for this simcha doesn't mean that we drive every single Shabbat afterwards. And it was that simple explanation, that simple sentence, that kind of put it all in perspective. That basically gave a sense of nuance of saying, listen, I appreciate you don't drive on Shabbat. I've chosen now not to drive on Shabbat either. But if there's no hotel in walking distance, and all we're going to do is drive to the bat mitzvah and home, and that's how we're going to celebrate for someone who's part of our family, I think that's what God wanted. And it doesn't mean that we drive on Shabbat now at all times. And what Dory was giving me was a sense of nuance that I was so desperately searching for. Because whether we suffer from autism or we don't, we all live in some linear world. And we as a society are growing devoid of nuance. I went to one of my rabbis, one of my gurus, as I was struggling through this Black Lives Matter issue. And I said to him, what do I do? He said to me, David, here's what you do. And this advice he gave me, it was so helpful to me, not only for this issue. He says, the next time there's a march for Black Lives Matter, you, as David Kirshner, as a white male, as the rabbi in this community, as someone with strong beliefs, you stand in the front of that line and you march with them. And you hold up a banner and you loudly declare unequivocally, Black Lives Matter, and you don't hesitate. And you don't quiver. You don't back down. You let everyone know Black Lives Matter. So I do. He says, that's what you do. Okay. He said, and then when the march is over, you get on a tree stump and you get people who think like you, and you denounce Black Lives Matter for putting an anti-Israel stance in their charter. And you lead and march in that same march that denounces Black Lives Matter for putting that in their charter. I said, so you promote them and bring them down? He said, no. You support the idea of Black Lives Matter, and you denounce them putting an anti-Israel stance in their charter. I said, oh, okay. He said, can you walk and chew bubblegum? I said, of course I can. He says, then why can't you understand that the notion of Black Lives Matter is important, but the anti-Israel stance is wrong? So make it sound pretty simple. Maybe it's more complicated because you're making it more complicated. And he was exactly right. In the case of Shireen Abu Akleh is a case where I unequivocally believe in the right of the Israeli Defense Forces to defend itself at all times. But I can still say that no innocent journalist should be killed or put in harm's way by the act of the IDF, whether accidentally or intentionally. And we own that level of responsibility. And by blaming the IDF for this death does not mean I am anti-Israel or blame the IDF for any suffering or challenges that happen to the Palestinian people. And it means that if I drive on Shabbat to a simcha that I'm celebrating with my family, that I have not forsaken the tenets of who I am as a Jew in those particular situations. What I'm saying to all of us is that if we struggle with a disorder in our brain that only allows us to think linearly, without any social cues or nuance, then when we are in the middle of the street that says walk and then it changes to don't walk, we will all be stuck. And we can live in a world of going back and forth and back between walk and don't walk, or we can say we're walking because it said walk, or we're not walking because it says doesn't walk, and we'll find ourselves on the corner with others and we will fight all day long. But I think we're more sophisticated than that. I think that we can understand, just like the Parsha told us in Pinchas, that yes, we have the 10 Commandments, and yes, it tells us we shall not kill. But if Pinchas decides to kill someone to stop future suffering, or to stop all the abominations that's happening, that's a nuance in where it's permitted. We know that it isn't as linear as we want to see it in these situations. And this linear approach is infecting our political world and discourse. It's affecting the way in which we look at almost any environment. And it's become dangerous to our society and the way in which we practice our religion and our lives. This is a moment for all of us to walk down the street, and as it changes from walk to don't walk, for us to be able to realize that we can finish our cross and wait for the next light to change. That we can live our lives with a sense of sophistication, complexity, and nuance. And in doing so, we are expressing the gifts that God gave us. May we find that ability to express those gifts, and may we celebrate them today and every day. Shabbat shalom, everyone.